Margaret Lascian Corla. Minister, I said to you when you walked in here this morning, why are you here and not the Minister for Housing, Darragh O'Brien? And you said you pulled the short straw, and indeed you have. But I'll tell you what I have noticed is that the Minister, unusually, has put in an amendment to our motion. Now, we have been sitting listening to private members' motions here for months now, where there's been no opposition from the government. They don't argue against it, they don't vote against motions, they just ignore them and let them run. This one, however, has been amended, and I've done a count on it. We have 21 short paragraphs in our motion describing what Richard and Paul have just outlaid in terms of what we think should be a beginning of a solution to the housing crisis. The Minister responds with 50 long paragraphs, and this place would drive you to drink, to be honest with you, because yesterday the same thing happened at the Climate Committee when I asked was there any intention of the government to go to COP27 and argue for more funding for people who are suffering from the extremities of climate change, and I got a civil servant going blah 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 for almost 20 minutes. Can we get decent answers to reasonable questions? And this motion poses very, very reasonable questions, and I want to pose a few more of them. One is in relation to Tahani House, which has been mentioned, in Dublin 8 in Kilmainham. One of our members lives there, a councillor of ours lives there. They've been there for over 10 years. They have spent $120,000 on rent in that 10 years. They are now being evicted by a landlord who happens to be, and I'm saying this for a reason because I'm going to follow on with another argument, one of our own, an Irish man called Ronald O'Donnell, who has made millions out of this block of flats, and he is evicting 35 families. And those families are not just Irish, they come from all corners of the planet, but they all work here, are rearing their children here, and they're all very, very scared of what's going to happen to them. Now, I wrote to the council immediately and said, this is in your area, we need housing, people here who are on the housing list, what are you going to do about it? And their answer is basically that there's no HAP or homeless HAP tenancies in Tahani House. There's a very small number of acting housing applications on DCC's list, and it's not straightforward for DCC to intervene. That tenants in situ protocol cannot be used unless there are HAP or RAS tenants there. So whatever we try to do here with these motions, there's always going to be obstacles with protocols and rules and regulations that are out there that are dragged up and brought in front of us by either local authorities or the Department of Housing. And the truth of the matter is that that is a perfectly good site for the council to buy, regardless of who lives in it. We need more public properties to get people into so that we can house them, so that we can give families security. And even if it was a question of buying it up and fixing it up, there is permanent homes for the future for people, so that they're not putting €120,000 down the toilet in rent over 10 years to be told at the end of it that they're going to be evicted. And this is really, really important in the context of the crisis of Ukraine and the amount of refugees that are coming into this country, because it is phenomenal, but it is nothing like what is going into other countries. Ireland, in fact, is down the table on the number per 100,000 of population of refugees that we are taking in. The biggest amount of refugees that move around this world when people are displaced go to some of the poorest countries and are allowed to stay in the poorest countries for years and get very, very little supports. So when people get very frustrated, and I perfectly understand it, I get it. People are sick of listening to Ukraine refugees getting this, that and the other, and what are we going to do about Ukrainian refugees? I get that. But people have to be very, very careful and remind ourselves that long before ever Russia entered Ukraine to embark on a war, long before there was any crisis in Ukraine and a refugee crisis, we had a deep, extreme housing crisis here. And it was put best to me by a young woman who's 19 years on the housing list in DCC at a public meeting recently in Ballyfermot. Somebody got up and was given out about the Ukrainian refugees, and she said, yes, I get it. We all think they're getting everything, but I'm 19 years on the housing list, and that's long before there was ever any crisis in Ukraine. So this housing crisis runs deep, but it will be used to divide people and to put us against each other. And when the question is asked, why do we not look after our own first? then let's ask the question, who are our own? Well, the landlord of Tahoney House is one of our own, if that's how you describe it. So are many of the people who evade paying taxes in this country, many of the landlords who own and sit on empty properties for years on end, and all of the politicians practically in this House are our own. All of the politicians on that side of the House who consistently, in decades of rules from Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, have brought us into this housing crisis and maintained us there. So I think it's very important that the issues are dealt with, that the Minister stops playing games, that he turns up here and defends himself. His counter-motion here reminds me of Lady Macbeth, who couldn't protest enough about being accused of doing something that she tried to say she was innocent of. And as Shakespeare said, me think the lady doth protest too much. In this case, me think the Minister doth protest too much, because he is absolutely guilty of all of the problems that have been outlaid here this morning, and the solutions have to be found, and they have to be found urgently. So, Minister, straight away I want you to address today the question of how we are going to deal with local authorities who, when it is needed, refuse to buy properties where tenants are being evicted from. And can we deal with specific cases where occupancies are not necessarily ticking all the boxes of local authorities' protocols, but tick the boxes of the need for ordinary people, for families right up and down this country. And it would accrue to us more public property, more public homes and housing that we would have in a housing stock on a permanent basis. So in the case of Helen's Court or Tahoney House or anywhere else, we need to instruct the local authorities to buy where they can, and to fix them up and make them habitable and permanent for people to live in proper, affordable public housing.